So welcome again, Jeremy. You've got an incredible story to tell, and we're telling it here at my place at Christie Walk on Ghana land. And yeah, I'd love to hear more about your days in South Africa under the apartheid regime.
And I was just remembering about it. It's highlighted by the death of Queen Elizabeth that I was in South Africa when South Africa became a republic, and I was just thinking about that and how we were so aware of the politics of apartheid in the country that even I would have been, I don't know what year it was, I'll look it up, but it was early 60s as far as I remember. And one of my sisters and I came home, and we'd got these medallions at school celebrating Republic Day, and we came home and smashed them up, and even knowing that we really didn't want to smash them up, we wanted to keep them because we thought they'd become valuable, eventually.
But you smashed them up because
basically we knew and understood, and it was about Britain kind of having been a moderator on South Africa for all those years in terms of what the government could do in terms of apartheid and controlling the police much more. And we knew, we really understood that South Africa, by becoming a republic, was being given the freedom to do whatever they wanted with apartheid, with none of that moderating force anymore. No. And I'm not sure how long that moderating force would have lasted anyway, but, who knows.
But you can see that it had the potential to give people free range.
Yeah, and that wasn't just from me as a child, a young person anyway. It was, my father had been very involved in an anti-republic movement that we didn't know about much at all, but we didn't know he was in that. But it was a group started, I think, they were called the Royal Carbineers, which was a defence force. So it was a group of vets from the Second World War who had fought on the side of the British Army, And remembering also that in South Africa, because a lot of the Afrikaners were on the side of Hitler and of Germany, so within South Africa itself it was very split, and there were even, that's when they were putting people of German heritage, Afrikaans people, in jail, in concentration camps, which they had done during the Boer War as well. And the British had just invented concentration camps, the whole nation. And you can still, if you go to South Africa now, you can see in the north part of South Africa, the old concentration, they're still there, the detention centres, which they set up for the Afrikaners. And you can, I really understand how this battle between the English and Afrikaans just keeps going on. It just was horrible. I mean, what the Brits did to the Afrikaners was appalling.
From the Boer War on?
During the Boer War and on, yeah. And so it was a fight for cultural survival,
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
See, none of that's taught in history either.
But that's why the Afrikaans, because the Dutch were there first in South Africa. And of the Europeans, the Dutch were there first, and then the British came and took over, and so and the Dutch left the Afrikaners by that stage. They'd been there for a couple of hundred years already, and become Afrikaans rather than Dutch. They'd left the Cape where the Brits had arrived, and they took off up to the Transvaal and up north of South Africa, on what they call the Great Trek, and they considered themselves doing the work of God. They were the chosen people.
What religion were they?
They were Calvinist originally, and they became Dutch Reformed. So the Church of the Afrikaans became the Dutch Reformed Church.
Seems like God's got a lot to answer for.
God's got a lot, and yes. And sometimes you wonder about the Reformation.
You do. And now is a very good time to be wondering about all of this, when there's it's absurd.
And I was just listening to the radio just now, and King Charles has he's been declared defender of the faith again. And he wanted, apparently, 10 years ago he had said something about he wanted to be called defender of faith, not of the faith, which would have been lovely, but it's gone through, and he's been proclaimed the defender of the faith, meaning the Church of England,
Meaning no other exists.
No other exists, yeah. No other Christian religions exist, let alone any other religions,
The pomp and ceremony, but obviously some people like it and revere it, and
I think it's much more to do with her as a person, though. She's a very fine example of a very stoic woman,
Absolutely.
A very stoic
Absolutely.
person.
You can't get around that.
And with incredible consistency, and she's just there all the time and has been, and and I can understand it from that point of view. But she it's not. I don't think people are that upset about the monarchy, or it's not about the monarchy. I don't think
it's about her.
It's about her.
Yeah, and she had a warmth.
Yeah.
That I think most people.
And she sort of introduced a progressive notion to the whole thing about how different people, her role involved. It wasn't just about being queen of the white British anymore. It was being queen of the Commonwealth, and the fact that she really pushed the idea of the Commonwealth, and she was very tolerant and accepting, and saw her job as actually she had to be the queen for all the people in Britain,
Did you read the letter that Paul Keating wrote, the piece that he wrote?
No.
It was the best that I've seen written, and it was in that vein that you're talking about now. That it was about. And nobody could have actually done it better than what she did, albeit a failed system.
I think she could have stopped a bit earlier, that's all.
Yeah. But you grew up knowing the Queen?
Absolutely. So I come from a town called Pietermaritzburg, which is the administrative capital of KwaZulu-Natal. So it's a small city. Durban's the biggest city, but Pietermaritzburg is the capital, and it was more English than Adelaide, and Adelaide was pretty English when I arrived here in the early 70s.
Yeah.
Pietermaritzburg was far more English, far more kind of. I can't even think of a nice term. It's kind of up itself, which it had nothing to be up itself about, except being the fact that it was so English still, full of private schools and cricket matches and cricket playing fields and all that kind of stuff.
All that stuff that reminds you of England. Yeah.
And my mother's family were very involved. They were absolutely traditional English ex-Scots living in Pietermaritzburg who were on the provincial council, so on the equivalent of the state government, and so we were part of the establishment too in Pietermaritzburg. It was
So was it always difficult in terms of black and white relationships in your memory?
It was always, there were always things I never understood, couldn't get. I didn't understand why things happened like they did. In my memory, always difficult, always. And white people generally were always racist. But, I think everyone who's born in a country like that is racist. You just grow up racist unless you know people who are different from you. And I think you just grow up racist because the way people are presented to you is that they're dangerous and they're different and they're not of your kind. And so I think it was always racist like that, yeah. And people were, but in a country like South Africa gave people the imprimatur to be as racist as they wanted to be as well. But then some of the stories that would come through about people being servants, particularly because all the white families at that stage, particularly in a place like Pietermaritzburg, had servants, had black servants, and it was just the way it was. And it was almost essential that people had an economy down there because there was no no support for anyone. So the poorest of the poor, there was no government money, there was no social services, there was nothing at that stage.
Was it?
I don't think there was for anyone. There was no health cover. There was no kind of. People had to pay. People had to pay for schooling. People had to pay for everything. Yeah. I mean, there were different schools, so black kids could go to particular schools, white kids could go to other schools, and some of them were government and some of them were private. And the churches became really important in that for offering schooling, decent education to some black kids.
So the church played an important role all the way through the apartheid era.
The church played a very significant role, yeah, particularly in the 50s and on after that. In the earlier years, I'm not quite sure, but it had started in the 40s, yeah. And the missions were really important, but what role they played was it's always a bit fraught with interpretation too.
And were the missions in the same context as it's used in Australia when you're talking about missions?
It was. I don't think the missions in South Africa didn't seem, from what I know, they didn't play. Here, the missions seemed to almost be an arm of government in terms of enforcing government policy. In South Africa, the missions certainly didn't see that as their role like they did here, as far as I know. But it was about proselytising. It was about turning people Catholic, basically. Those are the missions I know most about. But there were missions from all sorts of other Christian religions too. But the Catholic ones are the ones I know most about. Yeah. And
that was getting all people to be Catholic.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
They're welcomed.
They were welcomed. They'd have anyone on bums on seats, basically. Tickets to heaven.
Oh, that works.
Yeah, that's right. No, there was less. In my experience so born in 1951, I never heard any of the Catholic priests, nuns, hierarchy parents talk disparagingly of black people. Never, whereas that talk was very common through the country.
Were people good to their servants? Were they friendly with them?
Some people were really good, some people weren't. And it depends, like my mother, we had a servant who was with my parents from when they got married, so in 1946 or 47, somewhere around 46 I think it was. And she was then with them till 1970, so, over 20 years. My parents had 8 children, and Gracie had looked after all of us, as little kids. And when years after arriving in Australia, my mother discovered, through a sister of hers, she discovered that Gracie had had a child of her own while she was being a servant to my mother and looking after my mother's children. And in South Africa, Gracie couldn't have lived and worked where she was and brought her child with her. It was just illegal.
It was illegal.
It was illegal. So you could come, you could get a pass, you could take your pass with you as a black person and live in a white area. But you had to have a pass, but no one else could come with you. You couldn't bring any children with you, and you couldn't, it was just illegal. Yeah. And she would have been sent, she would have had her pass cancelled, and she would have had to go back to the country where she came from. Yeah.
So did she sleep over?
Yeah. She had a room at the back. She lived there. Yeah, lived there. They lived, all the servants had, they were called kayas, and they were rooms out the back, basically, outhouses, with a bathroom, with a shower and a toilet and a bedroom, and that's it. And
did you eat together?
No.
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 But you ate the same food?
No. No, so she would cook. My mother would cook mostly, but she would also cook, and they'd cook our meal, and then Gracie would cook her own food and eat in her room or outside. Yeah. And in fact, that's where I got my love of beans from, dry beans. I used to, I'd go and eat with her. She'd have a fire outside her kaya at the back when I was a little kid, and it was just such a treat. And eat boiled white beans, with lots of butter on them, and salt and pepper. It was just fantastic around a fire, In those days, for most people, didn't come out of the kitchen. They didn't come into the rest of the house. You had to clean it.
Yeah.
Or spent their time in the kitchen and in their place. And it was just, it's what everyone is used to. It's the way people did it. There was no, that wasn't governed by the country, by the government. It was just
what
the way it was, yeah.
Would you have got into trouble going out and sitting with her?
No, not with my parents, yeah. No. But, and she used to, servants would also have to call me boss, as when I was 5, a little kid, I was boss. And not only the servants, but any black people, like in the street and stuff, would call you boss.
Gosh.
That's
the sort of stuff that people really don't know about.
Yeah, it really warps your view of yourself and your place in the world. And no wonder white people from South Africa have such a reputation for entitlement, for acting in such an entitled way. Of course, because you spent your life entitled, And those days, no one, unquestioned, was absolutely unquestioned.
So, was it dangerous for you being an activist?
But it was dangerous. We were about 18, 19, yes, security police and people I knew, and the police started cracking down too. And it was the security police in particular were given more power, I think, or more money to have more of them. And so I lived, at one point I lived in a house at a Morris Brothers school, and we were border masters, and there were 4 of us.
What's a border master?
It was a boarding school.
A boarding school.
Yeah, Morris Brothers boarding school, and we had free accommodation in a cottage on the premises, and
while you were getting educated.
Yeah, while this was university. Yeah. And university was close by, and the security police. We were all involved in student representative councils and politics of some kind. And the security police would park outside. They went through a time when they parked outside our house in their big white car every night, and they'd just sit there outside the house, and be there for 3 hours, 4 hours.
Just to intimidate.
Us. They did things like, we never knew who did it, but someone went into our kitchen and turned all the gas things on the stove, and so that with nothing alight. So we went in there, and there was. The place was full of gas, They searched us, and one morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, and I found reports of this I'd kept from there, and that was the most intimidating, the most scared I've been, I think. Yeah.
What happened?
They came and just raided all our rooms, yeah, and looking for communist literature, which, you know, none of us in South Africa, I was particularly naive. I'd never even I'd heard of Marx, I'd heard of communism, but I knew nothing. And we were talking before, and I said that the only thing that I had illegal in the room was a Playboy magazine under the bed that someone had lent to me, you know, and they found that. Yeah. And one of them sat down and looked at it all the way through, you know. It's very funny. Of its time, you know, of its time.
Yeah. So how would they have known?
There were spies everywhere.
So people infiltrated. Yeah,
and one of my friends turned out to be a spy. You know, there were people. Yeah, a friend. There were people around the place. They'd pay people lots of money. They were apparently paying his university fees, and he came from a poor white family who couldn't afford university. You know, so you know that's why he was doing it. You know.
And how did you find out?
I haven't thought of it. I've just remembered. It was to do with drugs. And another friend of mine was talking about how they'd been taking some drugs. I mean, I didn't do that. It was too dangerous. In fact, he gave me my first joint ever. Oh. You know, in the park one day while he was a security police member. You know. Oh. And I found out about that, as well that day, where I think her name was Sharon, said, you know, he had confessed, he got really upset and said how he was actually a member of the security police, and you know he couldn't cope anymore doing what he's been doing. So I don't know what happened to him.
So he just disappeared out of your life?
Yeah, I think he left.
Would he have got killed, do you think?
No, I don't think so. No, he just left. There was security police everywhere. Student conferences we used to have, you know. 10% at least security police. Sometimes more.
And was the school that you went to renowned for activism?
That was the university.
The university, yeah.
No, all of the universities.
All were.
All universities were kind of engaged, at some level. And there was the days of student representative councils like here, you know, and the National Union of Students generally was very influential still in those days. Yeah.
Did you know people who supported the regime?
I had members of family, aunts and uncles, some who supported the regime, and who claimed afterwards that they didn't realise what was going on, you know, and they kind of acknowledged the fact that they had reported the regime and been very critical of my activism, and I still find it boggling and absolutely unbelievable that they said they didn't know what was going on. Everyone knew. Well, you just had to read the paper because the press was still fairly free in South Africa.
So it would be reported that...
Yeah, it was a small L liberal press, you know. Yeah. So it would be reported if there'd been raids like that, you know, it was all reported, the security police. Well, it wasn't. I don't know if it would ever said the security police, but the police, raided, and it would even named, you know, the report I was reading the other day named all the people who had been raided, and you know, gave reasons why they might have been raided, that kind of thing. No, the press was pretty good. You could keep up. There was no television. Mm. They banned television. In those early years of television, no TV was allowed into the country because the government thought it would be too dangerous in undermining apartheid. Yeah. because if people saw what was going on in the rest of the world. And it's interesting, it's kind of like they've got the power of the image, you know. I remember one thing when I really understood this, where the students at Cape Town had been protesting against, and I don't even remember what it was at the time. It could have been Winnie Mandela being imprisoned or banned again or something like that. And the police had gone onto the campus and beaten students up and stuff. And we heard it on the radio, and it had no kind of, oh well, they added again kind of thing. The next day there were photographs covering in the newspaper, like 3-4 pages of photographs of what happened. And suddenly everyone kind of really got it, And the protest spread around the country instantly. There was the images were there, and so I can see why the government was so scared of television. Yeah, because the images of people. Yeah, absolutely. In a way that radio just doesn't do.
No. Was that common to take pictures like that?
Yeah. No, the newspapers were really good at that. Yeah. I was part of an organisation called the University Christian Movement, which was basically it was a liberation theology movement. So it was liberation theology, black theology, and the two people who really were behind it at the beginning, two white people, ex-ministers, one a Catholic priest and one a Methodist minister, both ended up in Adelaide. I mean, newspapers actually reported everything. They reported the lot, and even when Colin stopped being a priest, they reported that in the newspapers. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
And
because
he
was well known. Oh.
Because of everything that was happening.
Everything that was happening. He was getting no support from the Catholic, not enough support, or no support from the Catholic Church for what he was, basically. And he had. It was when they separated out Bantu black education schooling from white education schooling, and the government was insisting on separate schools for black kids and white kids, and he was the one who was really leading the battle against that. And because he was secretary of the Bishops' Conference, so he worked really closely with the group of bishops in the country. I
thought the church was instrumental in opposing apartheid.
The church became instrumental. It was even then. No one else was doing it,
Yeah.
And the church became instrumental later on in opposing apartheid. Yeah, absolutely. And by then, in fact, by the 70s, it was instrumental.
Yeah.
And my uncle was the Catholic Archbishop in Durban, and he was one of the leaders of the bishops and of the Catholic Church, who came back from the Second Vatican Council, with a fire in his belly about justice, and he started, and they started the Justice and Peace Commissions around the world too at that time, the Catholic Church, and that was something, what he was absolutely passionate about in South Africa, the Justice and Peace Commissions too.
And when would that have been? Around?
Early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, yeah. And he would, every week he would stand on street corners with placards and stuff, anti-apartheid stuff, So he was very well known, and not only him, but a lot of Anglican Church of England bishops were very active and involved as well, and Dutch Reformed Church even.